trapped Apache woman. She was ready to die until the cowboy made her believe in life again. Lena was born under the endless blue skies of the southwestern plains, where the wind swept through the tall grasses and the sun blazed without mercy. Her earliest memories were of laughter, the smell of campfires, and the songs her mother sang at sunset. But that world of warmth and safety did not last long. When Lena was still very young, her family's home was attacked. She remembered the smoke curling into the sky, the frantic shouts, and the sound of running feet over dry, cracked earth. In the chaos, her parents tried to protect her, but the pain of loss came too quickly and too sharply. Her father was taken away, never to return, and her mother disappeared in the confusion. Lena found herself alone, a small girl in a world that suddenly seemed enormous and cruel. From that day, Lena's life changed. She wandered from one place to another, sleeping under rocky ledges, in abandoned huts, or beneath the wide-open sky. She became skilled at moving quietly, at hiding from strangers, at finding food and water where there seemed to be none. The desert and the canyons became her home. She learned which plants could be eaten, which could heal a cut or a burn, and which were dangerous. She learned to read the clouds and listen to the wind for signs of weather. Survival became second nature, but every day felt heavy with grief. Even as a child, Lena understood that life could be cruel. People she encountered often looked at her with suspicion or fear, whispering about the Apache girl who lived alone. Some were kind, but kindness in the world she now lived in was rare and fragile. And with each step she carried the memory of her family, the echo of her mother's voice, and the shadow of her father's eyes. Those memories were both a comfort and a pain, a reminder of what she had lost and why she must keep moving. Years passed, and Lena grew taller, stronger, more aware of the harshness around her. She became an expert at traveling without leaving a trace, finding shelter in the cliffs, and moving silently through the night. Yet, no matter how skilled she became, loneliness pressed in like a constant shadow. She longed for someone to share her life with, someone who could see her not just as a survivor, but as a person with dreams, hopes, and feelings. But in the quiet of the canyons, there was only the wind and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. Her heart was heavy with sorrow, but it also held a stubborn spark of resilience. Lena learned to speak softly to herself, to remember the songs of her mother, and to imagine a world where kindness existed. She taught herself to hope, even when hope seemed impossible. She would wake at dawn to the golden light spilling across the desert, take in the sharp, clean air, and remind herself that she was alive. That was her victory each day. She was alive, despite everything. As Lena grew older, she encountered other travelers and settlers. Some were friendly, offering food or a place to rest, but many were suspicious or cruel. She learned to keep her distance, to trust only when necessary, and to walk away when danger approached. Her life became a careful balance between survival and avoidance. She had to be strong, quiet, and aware at all times. And yet, in the depth of the night, when the campfire had burned low and the world was silent, Lena allowed herself to remember her family. She whispered their names into the wind, hoping somehow, somewhere, they could hear her. One particularly cold winter, Lena found herself near a small, abandoned settlement. The houses were empty, their windows broken, their walls faded and cracked. She explored carefully, checking for danger, and found a small hut that had once been someone's home. It was dark and cold, but it offered shelter. Inside, Lena lit a small fire, warmed her hands, and felt the quiet thrill of safety, even if only temporary. She ate some dried roots and berries she had gathered earlier, And as she lay down to sleep, she listened to the wind rattling through the broken windows. The sounds reminded her of her childhood, of the nights spent under the stars, listening to the whispers of nature. Despite the hardships, Lena had a deep connection to the land. She understood the patterns of the seasons, the migrations of animals, and the changing colors of the rocks and soil. She could track a rabbit's path, find water in the driest months, and climb cliffs that others would not dare attempt. The desert was harsh, but it was also honest. It demanded respect and patience, and in return, it gave a sense of freedom that cities or settlements could never offer. Lena felt alive in this way even when her heart ached. Yet the weight of her past was never far. Memories of the raid that destroyed her home often came unbidden. Faces she could never forget. Cries she could never erase. The fire that consumed everything she loved. They haunted her dreams. There were times she walked the plains and thought that life might not be worth living. The loneliness, the constant struggle, and the pain of remembering could feel unbearable. She had learned to be self-reliant, but there were moments when even the strongest resolve felt fragile. One afternoon, Lena came across a herd of deer drinking from a small stream. She watched them quietly, hidden among the rocks. The sight reminded her that life continued, even in places that seemed empty or dangerous. She realized that, like the deer, she too was part of a cycle, connected to the land and to life itself. It was a small comfort, but it reminded her that she had survived every challenge so far. She had endured. She had lived. Despite the harshness of her existence, Lena had moments of beauty and joy. She would sometimes climb to the top of a cliff at sunset and watch the sky explode with colors of gold, pink, and purple. She would listen to the songs of birds and the rustle of small animals in the brush. She would trace patterns in the sand and rocks, imagining stories and histories that had existed long before her. These moments gave her strength, even if she could not fully escape the sadness that lingered in her heart. The years of wandering had shaped Lena into a resilient, thoughtful, and cautious woman. She had survived dangers most could not imagine, and had learned the value of silence, observation, and patience. But more than anything, she had learned the depth of her own grief. Her heart carried the weight of loss, and it seemed that no one could share it. She had become a shadow in the land, a silent witness to life around her, never fully part of it, but always observing, always learning, always enduring. And yet, even in the depths of her solitude, there was a small, flickering light. Deep inside, Lena had not completely given up. She longed for connection, for a reason to hope again. She did not yet know how or when that change would come, but somewhere, in the vast desert and endless sky, a part of her remained ready for life. That part was fragile, often hidden under layers of fear and pain, but it existed. So Lena continued her journey across the plains and canyons, day by day, step by step. She carried her memories with her, her knowledge of survival, and her quiet hope. The world had been cruel, but it had also been her teacher, and somewhere she knew someone or something could enter her life and change the course of her story. For now she remained vigilant, alert, and determined, living in the harsh beauty of the land and the unspoken promise of something more. The wind whispered around her as she climbed a ridge that overlooked the endless horizon. The sun touched the rocks in shades of fire and gold, and Lena paused, letting the warmth sink into her tired bones. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Despite the hardships, despite the memories that weighed on her, she was still here. She had survived. And perhaps, just perhaps, survival could become something more. The desert was quiet, but Lena's mind was loud. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Yet the weight of loneliness pressed down on her like an invisible stone. She had survived storms, harsh summers, and bitter winters, but survival alone was no longer enough. Something deep inside her ached, not for food or water or shelter, but for a sense of belonging, for a reason to wake up every morning. She moved through the canyons with careful steps, always alert. The rocks beneath her feet were familiar, but the emptiness around her was constant. She passed abandoned settlements, dry riverbeds, and overgrown trails where no human had walked for years. The land was beautiful in its own way, with cliffs that glowed in the sunrise and streams that sparkled like glass in the afternoon sun. Yet beauty offered little comfort when her heart felt hollow. People she met along her journey brought more pain than relief. Travelers sometimes offered food or a kind word, but suspicion was always there, hidden in their eyes. Some whispered about her when she walked past, calling her the lone Apache girl, as if that title defined everything she was. It reminded her of her past, of the family she had lost, and of the nights she had spent crying alone under the stars. Lena had learned to ignore them, but it stung each time, opening old wounds she had worked so hard to cover. The hardest moments came at night. Lena would make a fire in a small, hidden cave or in the shelter of a rocky ledge, the smoke curling into the dark sky. She would sit close to the flames, staring at the dancing shadows, thinking of what could have been. She remembered her mother's soft voice singing lullabies, her father's strong arms, and the warmth of her family gathered around a fire. Those memories felt both comforting and painful. They reminded her of a life that had been stolen and a future that seemed impossible. Sometimes Lena thought of giving up entirely. She had learned to survive, but surviving felt empty. Each day was the same: find water, gather food, avoid danger, and sleep under the stars. It was a life without joy, without laughter, without connection. She wondered if continuing was worth it. What was the point of walking through this harsh land if there was no one to share it with, no one to care about, no one to care for her in return? The thought of ending the struggle lingered in the back of her mind more often than she cared to admit. Yet even in her darkest thoughts, Lena could not fully give up. She had survived too much to simply vanish. Each day she reminded herself of this fact, repeating it quietly. I am alive. I am still alive. Those words became a fragile anchor. They didn't erase the pain, but they gave her a reason to take the next step, to move forward, even if the path was uncertain and lonely. The desert tested her constantly. One day a sudden storm swept across the plains, dark clouds rolling in like waves. Rain poured down, soaking her thin clothing, and strong winds threatened to knock her off balance as she climbed a ridge for shelter. She huddled beneath a rocky outcrop, shivering, trying to stay dry. The storm lasted hours, and Lena felt every ache in her body. But she survived it, as she had survived countless storms before. The land was harsh, but it was honest. It demanded strength, patience, and courage, and she had all three in abundance. Even so, the isolation gnawed at her. Lena longed to speak to someone who would understand her without judgment. She wanted a voice that would listen to her fears, her regrets, and her memories, without turning away. The world around her offered no such comfort. Settlers moved through the land with suspicion or hostility. Other travelers rarely lingered long enough to form any connection. Lena realized that she had become a shadow, a figure who moved through life unseen and unacknowledged. At times she tried to imagine what it would be like to belong somewhere again, to have a home, to have people around her who cared. She pictured herself sitting by a fire with someone who spoke kindly, who shared her burden, who would remind her that life could be more than survival. These daydreams were brief, fragile things, and they often left her feeling more sorrowful than hopeful. Yet they were the only reminders that something better might exist beyond the harsh desert. Food became harder to find during the long winter months. Lena tracked small animals through the snow, collected roots hidden beneath frozen soil, and caught water from icy streams. Her hands were rough, her face cracked from wind and cold, but she endured. She learned to conserve her energy, to make use of every scrap of food, and to prepare herself for nights when the cold threatened to steal her life. Each challenge strengthened her body, but her spirit grew weary. Survival had become mechanical, almost automatic, and the spark of hope she had once carried flickered faintly, barely visible. Loneliness was a constant companion. There were nights when she curled up close to the fire, hugging herself for warmth and comfort, wishing she had someone beside her. She longed for even the smallest sign of human connection, a smile, a gentle word, a shared meal. But the silence of the desert reminded her of what she had lost and what she might never have again. And in those moments, Lena felt the weight of despair pressing down, heavier than any storm or hunger could ever be. Yet, even in her despair, Lena remained clever and resourceful. She discovered new ways to find food, to navigate the rugged terrain, and to protect herself from danger. She noticed patterns in the behavior of animals, read the sky for changes in weather, and listened to the wind for signs of travelers. The desert had taught her many lessons, and she had mastered them all. But mastering the land did not master her heart. She remained trapped in the cage of her own thoughts, struggling to find a reason to keep moving forward. One day, while exploring a narrow canyon, Lena found a small, hidden oasis. The water was cool and clear, surrounded by grasses and small trees that provided shade from the relentless sun. She knelt by the stream, cupping water in her hands, and drank deeply. For a moment she allowed herself to feel something beyond survival, relief, calm, and even a hint of happiness. It was fleeting, but it reminded her that life, despite its hardships, could still offer small gifts. These moments became precious, tiny reminders that the world had more to offer than pain and loneliness. Still, Lena could not shake the shadow of her thoughts. Some nights she would stare at the stars and wonder if anyone, anywhere, understood her suffering. She imagined voices calling out across the desert, hoping for a response that never came. She longed for reassurance, for someone to tell her that life was worth living, that survival could lead to joy, and that she could find connection again. But the desert offered no answers, only silence and the echo of her own thoughts. The emptiness began to feel heavier each day. Lena found herself walking for hours without speaking, without seeing anyone, lost in her own mind. Thoughts of giving up lingered more strongly now. She imagined lying down beneath the sky, letting the wind and earth take her away, ending the endless cycle of struggle. But even then, she could not fully surrender. Some small part of her still clung to life, whispering that there might be hope, even if she could not see it yet. Despite her growing despair, Lena remained cautious and intelligent. She avoided danger wherever possible, always scanning the land for threats. She built small shelters in caves or under cliffs, made fires when it was safe, and moved silently through the wilderness. Her skills were unmatched, honed by years of solitude and struggle. She knew how to survive, even when her heart was heavy and her spirit weary. And though her hope was fragile, she carried it like a hidden ember, waiting for the right moment to ignite. Even in her darkest moments, Lena remembered the teachings of her family and her people. She thought of the stories her mother had told her, of the lessons passed down through generations. They reminded her of strength, resilience, and the importance of patience. She clung to these memories, allowing them to guide her through nights of despair and days of relentless survival. The desert was cruel, but it was also a teacher, and Lena had learned the lessons it offered with patience and skill. So she continued to walk the plains and canyons, step by step, day by day. Each morning she rose with the sun, took in the fresh air, and reminded herself that she was alive. Despite the weight of grief and loneliness, she pressed on. She searched for small signs of life and beauty, moments that reminded her that survival was not enough, that life could still hold meaning. And deep inside, hidden beneath the layers of sorrow and fear, a tiny spark of hope remained, waiting for the moment it could grow into something stronger. One morning, Lena awoke to the faint golden light of dawn spilling across the canyon walls. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of the desert and the distant sound of a small stream trickling over rocks. She stretched her stiff limbs and prepared to move along her usual path, scanning the horizon, as always. Her life had become a careful routine of survival, a rhythm of walking, finding food, and avoiding danger. Yet today, something in the air felt different, a subtle shift she could not explain. As she descended into a narrow valley, Lena noticed tracks in the soft soil. They were fresh, deep footprints, clearly made by someone who had passed this way recently. She paused, crouching low behind a boulder, and studied the prints. They were larger than hers, and the pattern suggested a steady, deliberate pace. Lena's first instinct was caution. She had learned that travelers could be dangerous, carrying intentions that were unpredictable and sometimes cruel. Yet there was something unusual about these tracks, a sense of carefulness that did not match the rough, careless travelers she had encountered before. Curiosity, a feeling she had almost forgotten, pulled her forward. She moved silently, following the tracks at a safe distance, hiding behind rocks and low shrubs. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, and Lena continued her cautious pursuit. Finally, she spotted him. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, was tending to his horse near a small patch of shade. He wore worn boots and a wide-brimmed hat, his clothes dusty from travel. He did not notice her immediately. His attention focused on the animal. Lena watched quietly from a distance. There was something calm in the way he moved, a deliberate gentleness in his gestures as he checked the horse's hooves and adjusted the saddle. He did not shout, he did not hurry, he simply worked with care and patience. Lena felt a strange sense of intrigue. She had not seen many people in years, and the sight of someone moving with both strength and care was unfamiliar. For the first time in a long while, her mind wandered from survival to thought, wondering who this man was, why he traveled alone, and what kind of life he led. The man, whose name was Samuel, noticed Lena eventually, though not with anger or suspicion. He squinted toward her hiding place and gave a small, cautious smile. "Hello there," he called softly. "I mean no harm." His voice was gentle, warm, and steady, carrying no judgment or fear. Lena hesitated, unsure if she should trust him, her instincts warning her to remain hidden. Yet there was something different in his tone, a sincerity she had not heard in years. Slowly, Lena stepped out from behind the rocks, keeping her hands visible to show she carried no weapon. Samuel watched her without moving abruptly, allowing her space. "It's safe here," he said quietly. "You don't have to hide from me." Lena's heart raced. She had not interacted with another person in years. Not truly. Her trust had been broken so many times that the idea of approaching someone, even someone seemingly kind, felt foreign and dangerous. But Samuel's calm demeanor, the way he worked with the horse without rushing, and the gentle tone in his voice sparked something inside her, a flicker of curiosity and a tiny hint of hope. She approached cautiously, each step measured, her eyes never leaving his. Samuel noticed her hesitation and simply nodded, not pressing her, not asking questions. The silence was comfortable, not tense. For Lena, it was a new and startling feeling. Someone who did not rush her, someone who respected her space without needing to claim it. Over the next several days, Lena observed Samuel from a distance, learning his patterns. He moved through the land with a quiet confidence, setting up camp carefully, keeping his fire small but effective, and always taking care of his horse. He survived, yes, but he did more than survive. He lived with a sense of balance, a careful respect for the land, the animals, and the small moments that made life meaningful. Lena was fascinated. She had survived in the desert, but she had never truly lived. Watching Samuel, she realized that there might be another way to exist in the world, one where survival and life could coexist. Eventually, Samuel noticed Lena watching him and spoke again. "You've been following me," he said, not accusingly, but as an observation. Lena froze, unsure how to respond. She wanted to explain, to retreat, and yet part of her wanted to step closer. I just watch," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I mean no harm." Samuel nodded, as if he understood without needing more explanation. "That's all right," he replied. "You don't have to explain yourself to me." The first time they spoke at length, it was over something simple. A stream of water where Lena had found herself thirsty, and Samuel had quietly shared the source. Lena kept her distance, taking a cautious sip while Samuel remained on the other side of the small creek. There was no rush, no pressure, only the quiet sound of water flowing and the distant wind moving through the canyon. For Lena, it was a startlingly peaceful moment, one that made her heart pound in a way it had not in years. She realized that she could exist near another person without fear, that kindness could exist without demand. Days turned into weeks, and their interactions slowly increased. Samuel never forced conversation, never pressed for details of Lena's past, and never judged her silence. He simply existed in the same space, a steady presence in the harshness of the land. Lena began to feel something she had thought lost forever, a sense of trust. She began to speak in small ways, sharing simple observations about the desert, pointing out animal tracks, and noting the weather. Samuel listened with interest, never dismissing her words. He treated her as an equal, not as someone broken or in need of fixing. Lena's heart, long closed off, began to open just a little. She laughed quietly once when Samuel clumsily dropped a cooking pot and cursed under his breath, shaking his head at his own clumsiness. It was a small, fragile sound, but it felt good. She had forgotten how it felt to laugh, to feel light in the weight of the world. Samuel smiled at her softly, not mockingly, but with warmth, and she realized that moments like this could exist, even in a life defined by struggle. Their bond grew slowly, built on shared silence, small kindnesses, and the unspoken understanding of life on the frontier. Samuel never asked Lena to change, never questioned her past, and never pressed for emotional openness. He simply shared his presence, his work, and his quiet companionship. Lena found herself watching him, not for fear, but for the calm assurance he seemed to carry in every step, in every action. He moved through the land like it belonged to him, not with possession, but with respect. For Lena, Samuel became more than a companion. He became a mirror reflecting a life she had long forgotten. Through him, she saw that strength did not have to mean isolation, that survival did not have to mean loneliness, and that life could be lived, not merely endured. She began to imagine what it might be like to exist in partnership, to have someone to share the small moments with. The quiet of dawn, the warmth of a fire, the beauty of a desert sunset. One evening, as they sat by a small campfire, Lena found herself speaking more openly than she had in years. She told Samuel about her family, about the raid that changed her life, and about the years she had spent alone in the desert. She spoke slowly, carefully, measuring her words, unsure how much he would understand. But Samuel listened without interruption, without judgment, simply nodding and occasionally asking gentle questions. His presence was steady, a safe harbor in a world that had often been stormy and dangerous. By the end of the evening, Lena felt a weight lifting from her heart. She realized that she had allowed someone into her life for the first time in years. Not fully, perhaps, but enough to notice that trust and connection could exist. She watched the flames of the fire dance, reflected in Samuel's calm eyes, and understood something profound. Life, even after the harshest trials, could offer moments of peace, hope, and companionship. The next morning, Lena awoke with a strange mixture of fear and excitement. She wondered if her growing attachment to Samuel was wise, given her past and the dangers that existed in the world. But she also felt a quiet determination, a sense that perhaps she could allow herself to trust, to hope, and to believe that life could be more than survival. The spark that had been flickering in her heart for years began to grow stronger, nurtured by Samuel's consistent presence and kindness. And so, Lena's life began to change, not all at once, and not without hesitation, but slowly, day by day. Samuel had entered her world, not with force or expectation, but with patience and respect. In him, she saw a glimpse of a life that was possible, one where she could exist not only as a survivor, but as a person capable of connection, laughter, and hope. The journey ahead would not be easy, and Lena knew the past could never be erased, but for the first time in a long time she began to imagine a future worth living. Lena had begun to feel a quiet change in her heart. Samuel's presence had become a steady light in the shadowed corners of her life, a light that reminded her of the possibility of trust and care. But life in the frontier was never easy, and the road ahead held challenges that would test not only her skills, but her very will to embrace hope. Winter had passed, leaving the canyons dry and the plains wide and dusty. Spring brought warmth, but also unpredictability, sudden storms, shifting animal patterns, and the constant need to hunt and forage for survival. Lena and Samuel traveled together, moving through the land with careful steps. Each day brought small tasks, checking their supplies, gathering firewood, tracking game, and finding water. These tasks seemed ordinary, yet in each of them lay a test. Life in the wilderness demanded patience, teamwork, and trust. For Lena, learning to share these responsibilities was more difficult than surviving alone had ever been. She was used to relying only on herself, to trusting only her instincts. But with Samuel, there was a subtle, unspoken lesson. Strength was not always about going it alone. Sometimes it was about letting someone else help, about working together to face the challenges that life threw at them. This idea was foreign to Lena, and she resisted it at first, stepping back when Samuel offered assistance or guidance. One morning, while gathering water near a stream, Lena slipped on the slick rocks and nearly fell into the rushing current. Samuel's hand shot out, steadying her before she could fall. She looked at him, startled, and for a moment felt the warmth of his concern like sunlight on her skin. "Careful," he said softly. Lena nodded, realizing that accepting help did not make her weak. It made her alive in a different way, allowing her to see that she could rely on someone without losing her independence. Days like these were small victories, yet the true struggle was deeper. Lena's mind carried old fears and grief. Memories of her family, the raid, and years of loneliness often returned, unbidden and sharp. Some nights she woke screaming silently into the darkness, clutching herself as if she could hold together the pieces of her shattered past. Samuel never forced her to speak. He simply stayed near the fire, letting her know, without words, that she was not alone. The bond between them grew slowly, nurtured by moments of silence, shared tasks, and small conversations. Lena began to talk more openly, sharing stories of her childhood and the lessons her parents had taught her. She spoke of the songs her mother had sung and the wisdom of her father's words. Samuel listened without judgment, encouraging her gently when she faltered and asking questions that showed he truly wanted to understand. For the first time in years, Lena felt heard, truly heard, and the heavy weight in her chest began to ease. Yet the frontier was unforgiving. One afternoon, while they were tracking a herd of deer for food, a sudden wildfire broke out across the valley. Smoke rose in thick columns, and flames licked the dry grass with frightening speed. Lena and Samuel had to act quickly. They worked together to lead the animals away from danger, guiding them toward a safe path and shielding the smaller ones from the smoke. The fire roared around them and Lena's heart pounded, but for the first time, fear was tempered by confidence, not only in herself, but in the quiet assurance that she was not facing this alone. After the fire, as they rested beneath the shade of a large rock, Lena looked at Samuel and realized how much she had changed. The fear that had once dominated her life had not disappeared, but it had been tempered by trust and companionship. She felt a new strength, one that came from understanding that life could be harsh and beautiful at the same time, and that enduring hardship could be shared without diminishing her own power. Their struggles were not only with nature but also with human life on the frontier. One day they encountered a group of travelers passing through the area. The travelers eyed Lena warily, unsure of her intentions or background. Some spoke harshly, making assumptions based on her appearance. Lena instinctively bristled, ready to retreat or defend herself. But Samuel stood beside her calmly, not confronting them aggressively but simply allowing his presence to act as protection. The travelers eventually moved on, leaving Lena feeling both relief and gratitude. She realized that with Samuel, she could face the world with less fear, knowing she had someone she could trust. The true test of Lena's transformation came one cold night, when a blizzard swept across the plains. Snow fell in thick, heavy layers, and the wind howled like a living creature. Lena and Samuel struggled to build a shelter and keep their small fire alive against the relentless storm. It was exhausting, terrifying work, and there were moments when Lena doubted their ability to survive. Yet, together they persevered. They supported each other physically and emotionally, finding warmth and encouragement in the shared struggle. By the morning, exhausted but alive, Lena understood something profound. Strength was not only measured by what she could endure alone, but also by the courage to face challenges together with someone who cared. Through these shared hardships, Lena's view of life began to shift. She realized that survival, while important, was no longer the only goal. Life could be meaningful in small, shared experiences. Preparing a meal together, tending the fire, listening to the wind through the canyons, and sharing quiet laughter at the simple mistakes or accidents that occurred in daily life. Each moment, each act of trust was a step away from despair and a step toward hope. As spring turned to summer, Lena noticed changes within herself she had long thought impossible. She laughed more easily, her steps through the desert felt lighter, and she began to dream again. Dreams of belonging, of connection, of a life not defined solely by survival, returned. Samuel's gentle influence allowed her to see that life could be more than endless struggle. She had learned that pain and loss did not have to define her entirely. They could coexist with trust, companionship, and even joy. Despite her growth, Lena remained cautious. Trust did not come instantly, and the scars of her past were still present. There were nights when memories of her family returned with a piercing intensity, and she felt the old ache of grief. But Samuel's quiet presence reminded her that she did not have to face these feelings alone. Slowly, she began to share her fears and pain, finding relief in his listening and understanding. The act of speaking aloud, of being vulnerable, was a new kind of strength, one she had never known in her years of solitude. Through the seasons, Lena and Samuel faced many more challenges: sudden floods, scarce food, and dangerous wildlife. Each event tested their skills, patience, and determination. But through it all, Lena found herself growing not just in strength, but in spirit. She realized that life, even when unpredictable and harsh, could offer moments of beauty and connection that made the struggle worthwhile. With Samuel, she discovered that hardship could be shared, and that hope could flourish even in the most unlikely places. By the time summer was in full swing, Lena had changed in ways she could scarcely recognize herself. She had gone from a woman isolated and resigned to despair, to someone capable of trust, laughter, and hope. Her heart, once heavy with grief, now carried a fragile but growing sense of life's possibilities. Samuel had not forced this change upon her. He had simply existed as a steady presence, showing through action and patience that life could be lived differently. One evening, as they sat together watching the sun dip below the horizon, Lena realized she no longer feared the future. The memories of her past still lingered, and she knew they always would. But they no longer dictated her every thought and action. She had learned that survival was not enough, that living required trust, connection, and the courage to open one's heart despite the risk of pain. In that quiet moment, Lena understood that the struggles she had endured were no longer burdens to carry alone. She had someone who could share the weight with her, someone who could stand beside her in the face of life's challenges. And for the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace and possibility, a feeling that she had thought lost forever. Through the struggles of the land and the harsh lessons of nature, Lena discovered the true strength within herself, the ability to trust, to hope, and to live fully. She had survived alone for so long, but now she understood that life was richer, more meaningful, and more bearable when shared with someone who cared. Samuel had shown her that even in a world defined by struggle, it was possible to find companionship, resilience, and joy. The desert remained harsh and unforgiving, but Lena no longer faced it in solitude. She had found a partner in Samuel, a man who respected her strength, understood her pain, and offered kindness without condition. Together they navigated the challenges of life in the frontier, growing stronger, wiser, and more connected with each passing day. Lena realized that the greatest struggles were not only external, but internal. The fight to reclaim hope, trust, and the will to live. And in this struggle, she had triumphed, slowly but surely, discovering a new way to exist in the world. By the time the first hints of autumn appeared across the plains, Lena felt a change deep within her that she had not expected. The air had cooled, and the wind carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and distant mountains. She walked through the canyons with a lighter step, the burden of years of grief and loneliness gradually lifting. Her life, once defined solely by survival and sorrow, had begun to hold meaning beyond endurance. Lena had spent years wandering the desert alone, her hardened by loss and pain. She had expected life to be nothing more than a series of struggles, each day a test of strength and endurance. But now, with Samuel by her side, she realized that life could offer moments of beauty, companionship, and even joy. The world was still harsh, unforgiving, and unpredictable, but it was no longer a prison. It was a place full of possibilities. They traveled together each day, moving carefully through the desert and across the plains. Lena had learned much from Samuel: how to ride with steadiness over uneven terrain, how to plan for scarce resources, and how to observe the land with patience and respect. But the greatest lessons were not about survival. They were about trust, kindness, and the courage to open one's heart. She had begun to understand that being strong did not mean facing life alone. True strength could be found in connection, in companionship, and in the willingness to share both burdens and joys. One morning, Lena and Samuel set out early to follow a herd of deer across a wide plain. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows and bathing the landscape in golden light. Lena felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. The wind whispered through the grasses, and the distant cry of a hawk sounded almost like a song. She realized she was no longer just surviving. She was noticing the beauty around her, appreciating the simple gifts of the land, and feeling alive in ways she had thought impossible. As they tracked the deer, Lena began to speak more openly, sharing stories of her childhood, her family, and her years alone in the desert. Samuel listened patiently, never interrupting, never judging. "I, too," he asked gentle questions, showing genuine interest and care. Lena felt the tension she had carried for so long begin to dissolve. For the first time, she understood that she could share her past without fear of rejection or scorn. She had found someone who saw her not as a wounded survivor, but as a person with strength, memories, and a future. Evenings were now moments Lena looked forward to. She and Samuel would sit by a fire, tending to the flames, sharing food, and talking quietly about the day. Sometimes they would simply sit in silence, listening to the wind and the sounds of the desert. Lena had learned that these small moments were profound. They were proof that life, even in its simplicity, could be meaningful. They reminded her that trust and companionship were gifts, ones she had never truly allowed herself to receive until now. Over time, Lena also began to reconnect with her own sense of hope and purpose. She thought about the future in a way she never had before. Perhaps she could plant a small garden near a spring, or create a safe place to rest during long travels. She began to dream of a life that included laughter, music, and stories shared around a fire, not just survival. These dreams were tentative, fragile, but they grew stronger with each passing day. Samuel's presence had shown her that life could be worth living, and she was slowly believing it. Yet Lena's journey toward fully embracing life was not without challenges. Memories of her family, the raid, and years of solitude sometimes returned with intense force, threatening to pull her back into despair. She remembered nights spent alone under the stars, crying silently into the cold darkness. But now, she faced these memories differently. She spoke of them to Samuel, sharing the pain she had carried for years. And in doing so, she discovered that her grief did not have to define her. It could exist alongside hope, laughter, and connection. The past was still a part of her, but it no longer ruled her life. One late afternoon, while resting near a small stream, Lena reflected on how far she had come. She remembered the little girl who had wandered the desert, scared, lonely, and broken. She thought of the long years she had spent hiding, surviving, and withdrawing from the world. and she realized with a quiet sense of wonder that she was no longer that child. She had grown stronger, wiser, and more capable, not only in surviving the harsh desert, but in opening her heart to life and connection. Lena's transformation was also visible to Samuel. He noticed the change in her laughter, in her eyes, in the way she moved through the land with confidence and grace. He had watched her grow from a woman defined by fear and pain to someone who could see hope, beauty, and possibility in the world, and he never took credit for this change, understanding that it had come from Lena's own courage, resilience, and willingness to trust. He had merely been there to witness, support, and walk beside her. The small victories of daily life became a celebration. They found food together, prepared meals, and worked to create a sense of home wherever they stopped. Lena began to take joy in these tasks, recognizing that the act of living, rather than merely surviving, was an achievement in itself. Each fire they built, each meal shared, each quiet conversation became proof that life could be gentle, rewarding, and meaningful. Over the months, Lena also began to notice a shift in how she viewed herself. She no longer saw herself as a victim of her past, or as someone condemned to loneliness. She was capable, resilient, and deserving of trust and care. She could allow herself to hope without fear, to dream without hesitation, and to embrace life fully. The spark that had survived years of sorrow had become a steady flame, illuminating her path forward. One evening, under a sky filled with stars, Lena and Samuel sat together near their fire. Lena gazed at the infinite sky above, the constellations shining brightly against the darkness. She realized how much she had changed. Fear, grief, and loneliness had once dominated her world, but now they existed only as memories, reminders of the strength she had found within herself. She reached for Samuel's hand, and he took it gently, silently acknowledging the bond they had formed. In that moment, Lena understood that life was a gift, fragile and unpredictable, yet full of possibility. She had been ready to give up, to surrender to despair, but she had discovered that hope could survive even the darkest times. Samuel had shown her that trust, kindness, and connection were not weaknesses but sources of strength. Through their shared journey, Lena had learned that life could be more than endurance. It could be lived, fully and deeply. As the seasons continued, Lena and Samuel faced challenges together, but now they approached each one as partners, not as solitary survivors. They worked to protect each other, to share knowledge, and to support one another emotionally and physically. Each obstacle became a chance to grow stronger together, each hardship a reminder that they could face the world united rather than alone. Lena's heart, once heavy and closed, had opened to life again, and with it, she embraced the joys, pains, and possibilities that came with living fully. By the end of the year, Lena knew she had transformed completely. The woman who had once wandered the desert alone, ready to surrender to despair, was gone. In her place stood a woman capable of hope, love, and resilience. She had survived the harshest trials, faced the deepest fears, and emerged with a heart open to life's possibilities. The desert, which had once been a symbol of isolation and pain, now represented strength, beauty, and the lessons that had shaped her. Lena's story became one of quiet triumph, not marked by dramatic victories or loud declarations, but by the steady, determined reclaiming of her life. She had discovered that survival alone was not enough. Living fully required trust, courage, and connection. Samuel had walked beside her, offering support, patience, and kindness, but the change had come from Lena herself. The courage to open her heart and believe in life again. In the end, Lena realized that life's greatest gift was the ability to hope, to connect, and to find joy despite hardship. She had learned that even after unimaginable loss, one could still embrace the world, find companionship, and create a life worth living. The desert had tested her, the past had haunted her, but she had triumphed, not over the land, nor over her memories, but over despair itself. And with Samuel by her side, Lena finally understood that life, in all its beauty and challenge, was worth believing.